do that with my counterpart, not their counsel, but our timing to
You have a percentage?
not double digits.
Hear you.
To be continued.
Thanks. Sorry.
Howie does double duty serving on the serving as a board member of WSSC. So,
All right, good morning. Chair notes that we do have the existence of a quorum here. We've got at least 8 members, so let the minutes reflect we have a quorum. And please record the names of the members who are present. And if there is no objection, I would like to proceed by unanimous consent directly to our guest speaker, Council President Evan Glass, in accommodation of his schedule, and thank him for taking the time this morning to be here and share his thoughts with us about the work of this commission. After which I hope we will have some time for some question and answers if your schedule allows for it.
Okay.
So I will turn the floor over to you.
well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody, for your interest and willingness to serve on the Charter Review Commission. It is one of the most important boards that we have in all of Montgomery County, among the 90+ boards, committees, and commissions. And its work often goes under the radar unless there's a big issue. And from time to time, there are some big issues. And I just want to say good morning, Dale. Just wanted to, come and say hi and talk with all of you, because one of the things that I have noticed over the last number of years is that sometimes the Charter Review Commission operates in a silo and operates here once a month, having conversations of consequence without necessarily receiving input or checking in with the county executive or the council. And as I'm sure Kondakile has briefed you, or that you've discussed on your own, any ideas that you come up with ultimately need to be approved by the council before making its way to the ballot. And that's why this conversation is just really important. And that's why I wanted to make sure I came early on to set those expectations, because I think the previous commission, for better or for worse, missed that memo. And they came up with some very thoughtful ideas for charter amendments that were very relevant, but they hadn't had the conversations with a number of us. And I think it's fair to say the county executive as well. And so when they presented their ideas, the council did not adopt them, leaving them feeling a little disgruntled, if I could say so. And I want to make sure that no one here feels that way. And so having conversations, having check-ins regularly along the way is a really important thing. I'm happy to give you all my cell number, right? My email, personal, any one of my personal or professional emails, and my DMs are always open. And I share that because as you have your conversations, there's going to be a lot of disagreement here, and that's a good thing. This body, much like our redistricting commission, is composed of people with lots of different political views, and it's designed that way. And ultimately, we're trying to find some consensus. The last thing we want is for our local government to reach the level of, what adjective do I use? Just look down on Capitol Hill. We do not want to become that way. And so we want our Democrats and Republicans and independents to be able to find common sense solutions. And that's really what you all are here for. That's why we've selected you and asked you to serve. And so with that, I'll just share some thoughts of relevant issues that people have been talking about. The council recently, well, let me back into it this way. The council is undergoing a series of changes. One of the changes that we are undertaking is we're hiring a new executive director. Marlene Michelson, who has been the council's executive director for the last 6 years, is retiring next year. Yeah.
To retire.
Pardon me?
She's too young to retire.
Yeah, yes, but she's got family that she wants to spend more time with. And she has been at the council for, I believe, 35 years. And has served in the last 6 as executive director. And one of the things, and she is terrific, and one of the things that we've learned through this process with her is she essentially is the executive director for the council, for the 11 members of the council, helping make sure that our offices run and that all of our committees operate and that the floor session is smooth. But she has shared with us that within the legislative branch, we also have the Office of Legislative Oversight, and we also have the hearing examiner. And that there are a few other very small functions of the legislative branch that the executive director has assumed control over, right? And we're not quite sure that that was what her position was meant to be. And I share that because all of those other functions are delineated within the charter. And so right now, the council, we have an ad hoc committee of which I chair to undergo the process of hiring a new executive director. And so we just met yesterday and are moving through that process in a very good fashion. And there's not a sense of the council to upend things right now because we want to hire a new executive director for next year. But further down the road for you all, maybe next year or the year after, looking at the legislative branch, look at whether or not there are ways to bring everybody in-house or have one executive director or a streamline of functions. There's also been conversation, the council had a retreat 2 weeks ago, and there was a conversation about Office of Legislative Oversight. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Office of Legislative Oversight, it is essentially our congressional research service, an independent group of researchers who help analyze legislation and policy and provide that information to the council and the public. There are some very thoughtful conversations about whether they should be merged, and the Office of Legislative Oversight should be more integrated with council functions so that they are part of our committee structure. They are part of the executive director leadership. But OLO is delineated within the charter, right? And so I share this because these are things that only you would be able to solve. I will say again, I just mentioned it, but I'll reiterate it. There is not interest among the council members at this point in time to engage in that conversation, especially as we're hiring a new executive director. But once we have a new executive director in place next spring, I think having a conversation so that not for the 2024 ballot, but perhaps for the 2026, if there's an interest amongst you all and amongst the council to streamline, that would be the appropriate time. Yeah.
Surely it would be better to have the conversation before the executive director gets on board. Otherwise, it's bait and switch on that person.
So I personally agree with that, but a majority of my colleagues do not. And so that is the will of the body. And Dylan, when you walked in, the very first thing I commented on was the need for the commission to have open conversation with the council, because any ideas that you come up with in order for it to get on the ballot need to be approved by the council. And so I agree with you. I'm all for making the change now so that the new executive director, we have this process in place. A majority of my colleagues would rather have the new executive director in place and work with that person to make changes that that person deems necessary. So it is what it is. But ideas for, for a few years down the line. There are always conversations about revenue. We had 2 ballot measures back in 2020. One was on taxation and revenue, and the other was on adding 2 new districts to the council, which was my proposal. Interestingly enough, both of them passed with exactly 63.5% of the vote, both of them. And so
Why is that significant?
pardon me?
Why is that significant?
Why do you ask? Rephrase your question.
Is it just coincidence that they both passed with the same amount of votes, or is it a majority?
I was just stating a fact.
Okay, coincidence.
It might have been a result of different organizations and political parties supporting and opposing. I haven't done kind of a deep dive as to where in the county who voted for what. But coincidence is definitely a word I would use for having the exact same percent, 63.5. Morning, Karen. I'll stop and, we can have a conversation. I know that you all have ideas, people have shared thoughts with me. And clearly there are reasons why you wanted to join the commission. And so for however long you'll have me, I'm willing to stay and have a conversation. So Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. I do have, I'm gonna go around and give everybody a chance to ask questions. I did have one, but you mentioned revenue, and so.
Yeah.
When people think of revenue, they think more of sort of a sense of urgency or a sense of immediacy. And so the question I ask is revenue an issue? You think has immediacy something that needs to be on our agenda for our first report this April, or is it something that to be studied on a longer term?
I think that's a big question, and you need to figure out what the goal is, right? Clearly, from my perspective, we can always have more revenue. It's a question of how we derive that revenue. There are constraints that we have that are in the charter. There are constraints that we have by the state. And the taxing authority that was expanded upon in the last charter amendment made sense to me because it allows for the natural increase in revenue, tax revenue, derived from natural growth. There is, I was going to say a belief, but I think it's just a fact that the charter and a number of amendments that have been added over the last number of years have artificially constrained taxing growth. And I'm saying the additional taxes, it's just natural taxing growth has been artificially constrained. And so the amendment that we passed 3 years ago relieved that a little bit. There are always questions about how much more to do. There are conversations in Annapolis not being had by me, but being had by other elected leaders about asking the state to provide us with greater taxing authority that the state can do independent of the commission and the charter. And so it all depends what one is looking for or what fix needs to be made. But I don't have anything at this point necessarily.
Well, that's good. Okay. I'm gonna start with something our staff circulated to all of us last week, which is some members at our last meeting requested that we get some sort of a list of what were the topics that council members and our executive brought to this commission, the last commission. We could sort of see that list and determine whether there was something that was on it that hadn't been done or hadn't been looked at. One of the things that popped out at me, there was an indication on the list that as far back as 2020, then council member Han Bremer and Gabe Albornoz both made comments in a public council meeting that this commission took note of, which is that they thought there ought to be some exploration of and consideration of whether or not we should go to a direct vote of the council president's position as a separate 4-year term position, rather than have council appointing the presidents consecutively 1 year at a time. I'm not aware that this commission looked at it. I looked at the list of topics from prior commissions. Apparently they had been on topic many years ago in the prior commissions. And so I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about that, and specifically if we were to consider that topic, whether you had any ideas for where we would start.
So thank you for that. So back in 2020, when we were talking about topics, when we were talking about potential charter amendments, the council brought 3 ideas to the table ourselves. One was adding 2 districts to the council, which was my idea, which a majority of my colleagues at the time, actually 8 of the 9 colleagues supported. Another idea that former Councilmember Navarro offered was in trying to figure out the configuration of the council, she had put forward a proposal to change the at-large makeup. Instead of having the 4 at-large being elected throughout the county, having residency requirements akin to how the Board of Education works. That was defeated by the members of the council, so that did not move forward. And then Hans Dreamer put forward an idea to have an independently elected council president, which would be a spinoff from one of the 4 at-large. So we currently have 4 at-large. One of them would become an independently elected president. There was much conversation at the time. And I think the sticking point among some was whether or not this new position would fall under the term limits or how it would fall under the term limits. What Councilmember Albornoz and I think 1 or 2 other council members argued was that at this point in time, that is a new position and it would reset the term limits for whomever's there, because it is unique to the other council member positions. There was much conversation about it, and Councilmember Raymer withdrew his motion, so it was never voted on, but it had a very short-lived but lively discussion from the dais. So you can go back to YouTube and you can actually watch that. I've evolved on my position on this. When I joined the council at first, I thought having a rotating presidency was a good thing, because what it does is foster a level of collegiality in which, as we have people become president and wanting to be president, and dare I use the word jockey to become president, it creates an atmosphere where no one wants to antagonize anybody else. And I think in politics, that's probably a good thing. Now that I am president, and I've been president for the last 10 months and have seen it over the last 4 years or so, 5 years. I think that it is somewhat short-sighted in the sense that every year things change. And central staff, including the executive director, end up having a new quote unquote boss or liaison every year. Central staff have to learn to accommodate and work with the new president. And whatever policies might have been set during that one person's year can be changed, and often is changed, sometimes at the margins, but it is different. And I think the institution is probably better served having an individual leader for a period of time for the flow and functionality of that body. Now, I think the topics or the points of debate are the term limits, as was, let me just finish this, Dylan, are the term limits, clearly, and I'm not weighing in on that, but that was a point of contention when Councilmember Raymer brought it up. The other thing to take note of is what kind of council president or chair, what kind of powers does that individual have? In Washington, D.C., the district's chair is basically another council member with the agenda setting authority. And the only other ability that chair has is creating the committee structure at the beginning of a term, which is exactly the same responsibility that the council presidency has at the start of a 4-year term. So I undertook that role of working with all 11 members of the council, creating a committee structure, working within a consensus to determine who's on what committee and who's chairing those committees, which is why I was able to push very strongly to create a new economic development committee. That was my initiative, and I got buy-in and support from my colleagues. The only way that a council president in Montgomery County can operate is with consensus. There's not one thing aside from creating the agenda for our Tuesday meetings that the council president can do. And our rules allow for a majority of council members to add something to the agenda if the council president doesn't add it. So there's checks to it. Now, that's just like how DC works. People also point to Baltimore City, where their council president is a very strong independent position that basically has final say on everything. And so sometimes when people talk about council presidencies, they warn of that council president. And there are members of the Baltimore City Council who affectionately look at how Montgomery County is, right? The pasture's greener always somewhere else. But I would not advocate towards a stronger council president because I think collegiality and collaboration is always the best way to go. But having continuity for a 4-year term, an individual who will who's the known entity to work with the county executive and their team during the term, I think there's merit to it. And if that's something that you all are interested in, I do know that there are members of the council who are interested. I can't predict, where it officially goes, but I think it warrants conversation. And I'm happy to talk more if people have questions about this.
So my question is, you may have answered it, but
Yeah.
is it a possible compromise to extend the term from 1 year to some other number?
So that is all within the council's prerogative. In Prince George's County, they have taken, I'll call it a precedent, of doing 2-year terms.
So that's not in the charter.
It's not in the charter. The council has the right to do it. There has been one instance that I'm aware of in the last 30 or 40 years in which a person has served 2 consecutive years, and that was Ike Leggett back in the 90s when he served as president in the 4th year of a term. And then I don't know if Howie, if you were here at that time, you were, then you'll have insight on that. He served as the president of the 4th year of a term and then the 1st year of the next term. And Mr. Leggett has openly talked about his support for a duly elected council president. He has long said that is a direction he thinks the county should go in.
If we're finished with that topic, let's entertain other questions if folks have other questions for our council president.
Yeah, David.
Thinking of the Office of Legislative Oversight, I'm curious about the scope of what it does. You mentioned the similarity to the Congressional Research Service, which does a lot of research relating to pending legislation. But I can also see that it conceivably could have a role in overseeing the implementation of new legislation, which is something GAO does. Reviewing the misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance of government programs as they're supposedly implemented over the lifespan of whatever legislation, which is also the GAO, and potentially reviewing the financial condition of the county related to proposed legislation, something the Congressional Budget Office does. How many of those things does OL do? And how much does that then affect whether the executive director should somehow be merged into those functions?
Excellent question. So let me break down a little further what OLO does. OLO does 2 things primarily. Council members will request reports on topics that are of interest to them, whether it is simply fact-finding or laying the groundwork for future legislation. They can request an in-depth or a brief report on a particular topic, and the OLO staff will compile that report I'm not sure, I think it's every fall of the workload. The schedule of reports are made public. And so you can easily find that. And then once a report is produced, it goes online. It comes to the council, it's added to our consent calendar. We approve it, and it goes live online for anybody to read. And I believe over the last number of years, all those reports have been digitized to the effect that you can type in various search words and see what reports are out there. The second function that OLO does is they are the staff that produce the environmental report and the social justice and racial equity report for every legislation. Both of those items are required by law. The council in the last term adopted the social justice and racial equity law, which requires OLO to produce those reports and provide thoughts on the racial equity aspects of any legislation. And then a few years later, we adopted a law saying that environmental review is required. So they do those two things. The other items that you mentioned are done by other agencies here in the county. The investigative function is done by our Office of Inspector General, which is an independent body, which is very busy these days, which is why we added a lot of funding to them, to their office in the last budget. And then the finance and implementation is an executive function. And so we have a finance department that crunches the numbers that are associated with pieces of legislation. And then ultimately, if our government systems are not working, that is the executive branch's prerogative to fix and or to implement. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Michael, and then Dylan, yeah.
Yeah, on revenue, you mentioned revenues, and taxes. In the charter, there's a provision for an affordability report. In the budgeting sections. How, if that was to be changed in some way, would you change it? Is there something that you look?
For anyone who has a chart, do you know where it is in the charter? So I know.
I think it's in 305.
Okay, if someone wants to either read it or show that to me, just so I understand the context.
305.
I believe it's.
Council may add to, delete from, increase or decrease any appropriation item in the operating or capital budget. Council shall approve each budget as amended and appropriate the funds therefor not later than June 1 of the year in which it is submitted. It is quite,
It might be 304.
it's on page 11.
Yeah, I would not change that item. Allowing the legislative body to have final approval over the budget. I regularly tell people that the County Council of Montgomery County is one of the most powerful legislative bodies I am aware of. And I say that from a statutory perspective, not a political perspective. I covered Congress for CNN for 12 years. I see how Annapolis works. I see how other jurisdictions work. There are no other legislative bodies I'm aware of that, in addition to having final budgetary authority, which goes to the extent of being able to rip up the entire budget the county executive sends over. When he transmits the whole budget, we can rip up every page and rewrite every penny. We don't have the time or wherewithal to do that, but that is what that section affords us. But then having sole land use authority and other nominating authorities, it is a very powerful body. And so I just expand upon that there. Is there the other section? Did you find the other section?
On page 12, the second paragraph down relates to affordability.
Right, exactly.
12, second paragraph,
Yes.
adopting spending affordability guidelines. Yes, so we just did that. We just did that in the last week or two, right, Dale? Yeah.
Do you rely upon the executive?
Yes, very much so. And so the spending affordability guidelines they are our roadmap. And they are designed partly with our based on the bond ratings that we have been given earlier in the year. And we are now I think in the 40th plus year of having a AAA bond rating from all three credit rating agencies. So they give their stamp of approval for the way that we have managed our finances for the last 4 decades. But then also based on this budget and projections, early projections for next year. And so it is a roadmap that will help the county executive over the next 6 months create his budget. And so that when it comes back to the council, when it's conveyed to the council, it is in line with expectations. It's a good thing. Yeah.
I wanted just to build on what was brought up about OLO.
Yes.
So you mentioned that the county executive does the financial, so in Congress, CBO is responsible for, every time piece of legislation is brought up, it has to cost it out.
Yes.
And it appears to, it seems like what you said was the executive branch does that.
Correct. Finance, yes.
Yeah, so isn't there a risk there that it's not trusted because it's independent? Like CBO, the point of CBO is there's a lot of independence, but independent leaders has separate terms. And the reason was you can't trust Congress to tell you how much Congress's ideas are going to cost.
Sure.
Do we have a similar risk?
So are there sometimes disagreements? Yes. I think they're few and far between because I give a lot of credit to our administration and our employees who have been here for a very long time, who predate this executive and his staff, and some of whom predate the former county executive Ike Leggett and his team, who were in place for 12 years. And so these are professionals. I don't really hear from colleagues or have heard from colleagues that change needs to happen due to any independence. Again, there'll be times where there might be a financial cost associated with legislation, and there might be a disagreement about, how it was derived. But those are few occurrences. They occur infrequently. So in a worst case scenario, that might be an issue, but I don't think it's been an issue thus far.
Other questions?
Anything else we haven't talked about? Ideas you have that brought you here? Karen?
One thing that's been popping up in a lot of my other discussions is the Office of People's Counsel, which I gather has been sort of a bone of contention for not getting anything done for about a dozen years. I guess it's on the books, anyway, is that something that, is there an interest? Is that something that the Charter Commission should mandate? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Independence, that's another.
So I think that's a really good question.
Good.
And well, wait till I answer it, Karen.
I was like, a good question.
No, it is. No, it's a very good question. And that's a policy decision, right? Should the county have an Office of People's Counsel that represents communities or individuals in land use disputes? I'll take that one step further and ask somewhat rhetorically, should the Charter Review Commission weigh in on what are otherwise political or legislative questions? That is a legislative question. And yes, the county executive has one very strong position. There are a number of council members that have opposingly strong opinions. And ultimately, when the county executive transmitted funding for that office in the last budget, it was removed. Going back to the section of the charter that affords the council to make those budgetary decisions. I would strongly caution the Charter Review Commission from weighing in on legislative or political debates. I think of you all, and you all should consider yourself the Constitutional Convention that convenes every 4 years or so, and leaving some of those more political debates to the election process, to the lobbying process, and to the annual budget process. But it's a very good question.
I just was kind of getting a sense of where that fit into this whole.
Because I think there are other issues that as you talk to people, they might weigh in and ask you to do some of these things. But I would just caution, and just like, foreshadowing a debate that will be had, that I'm sure you have all heard about. I don't think that charters should be changed to reflect the pleasure or displeasure with a particular elected official, right? The charter should be above the politics of the day and the sentiments of an individual, and should reflect what's in the long-term best interest of the county's residents and the political institutions that serve. Okay, sorry, Michael, yeah.
Another question related to the terms limits of the current council president under the current process. And since there's no direct election, which would presuppose then that you're elected for a full 4-year term, you're elected as a council member and then your colleagues elected you as president. Is your term 1 year as president, or is it 4 years as president?
So under the current rules of the council, and it might behoove you, just for your own edification, because you all, I will affectionately say, are government nerds like me, right? That's why you're here. You might want to just look at the council rules, which we actually updated just this year with this new council. We changed them at the end of last session, and we updated them this session to change some things, especially regarding special appropriations, and that might actually be something you want to look into. It's a topic that we just talked a lot about at our retreat, about the ability to change the budget in the middle of a budget cycle, right? But for and so the question that you asked is within the council rules, and it says in the council rules that a president will be elected, shall be elected every year, right, in December of every year. And so there is nothing stopping the council from re-electing a council president. I do not expect to be council president come December 7th. I expect, as tradition has held, our vice president, Councilmember Friedson, will become council president, and we're currently undergoing private conversations about who will be the next vice president. But there's nothing in our rules or in the charter that would prohibit continuation of a council presidency beyond 1 year.
A person who is not the vice council chair president could conceivably be elected in the next year.
Absolutely.
Instead of that person.
Absolutely. Yeah, which again, going back to former county executive, former council member Beggett, he served 2 consecutive years. Yeah, Dale, you.
And there was one other instance where the Nancy Florine became council president over the.
Yeah, so, well, that's why I said as tradition holds, right? So there have been hiccups, or notably one big hiccup. And that was back in 2007, 2008, 2009, because it was when Nancy Navarro was elected in a special election. So tradition usually is the real election is for vice president, because the tradition is the vice president then assumes the presidency after. And back in the day, there was great division on the council, and the factions were largely about growth and development. And so if you wanted growth and development, you fell in one camp. If you wanted limited, slower growth, you fell into another camp. And it was those 2 factions that elected leadership amongst themselves. It is not dissimilar to what is happening in Prince George's County right now. Prince George's County has 11 council members. There are 6 that identify as a block and 5 that identify as a block. And the 6 that are in the majority are only electing themselves. They have only appointed themselves as chairs of committees. And so it used to operate somewhat in that way. And so Roger Berliner, former Councilmember Berliner, was vice president. At the time, he was in the more moderate growth camp. And when Nancy Navarro, through a special election, was elected to the council, she was in the growth camp. And they then had the majority. And instead of elevating Roger Berliner from vice president to president, they put Nancy Florine, who had been on the council for 7 years and had never been in leadership because of those divisions. And they elevated her from council member to council president. And so sometimes those happen. And that's, the consideration as well, right? How the collaborative nature works out. But thankfully, given our process, we haven't fallen into those camps. I'll be very candid with you and say that while I was working with all of my colleagues last year about the council makeup and about the committees, there were people who were advocating against having certain people in leadership or as chair, saying that person doesn't agree with my or our political philosophy. And I dispensed of that and said, we are above that level of politics. We all don't have to agree on every issue in order for someone to be in leadership. And so I think you see that reflective even in our council presence. Some people want to have a litmus test and I'm not saying council members, but sometimes people in the community want to have a litmus test and say only people who have voted or believe in certain things should be in leadership, but we tend not to subscribe to that.
I think you have to avoid the one issue voter problem. There's more than one thing you can be divided on, and the faction of six can be split up totally if there's another issue. So
I agree with that. And, you know, there are some very interesting votes that sometimes happen at our council. While there are a number of 6-5 votes, clearly, and you've seen that recently with regard to rent stabilization. You've seen it on some of the issues regarding the budget as well. Sometimes there are very interesting 7-4 votes, composition of which, you know, I've gotten texts from people saying, well, that was interesting, right? So it happens.
I have a question for you because it's the topic you started with. So
Okay.
it'll bring us back to the beginning, and if you have to go, I'll understand.
Thank you.
You opened by talking about the issue, the one issue that came as a recommendation from this body to the council last year, that they had not done enough collaboration with the executive and the council, and their recommendation on how to handle conflicting charter questions, ballot questions, if they're both approved and they conflict, was the issue you were referring to.
Yeah.
And it's an issue that I actually had some responsibility for looking into on behalf of another group. So I'm a little familiar with the issue. So I guess I really would like to know whether you think it's an issue that this group should go back and look at again, this time with some collaboration to see if a different answer might be derived, or whether you think it's an issue that just doesn't have enough interest from the council to continue looking at it.
Great question, Jim. So thank you. So the charter amendment that the council rejected last 2 years ago was specifically saying that if there are two charter amendments proposed, they are in conflict with each other, the one that receives the most votes would prevail. We rejected that, and I guess I could say I was the most vocal critic of that. And the reason I oppose that is because it hasn't happened, right? So I'm not sure what problem we were trying to fix. I understand in the greater context, 2 years prior, there were two charter amendments proposed. One, eliminating at-large council members and having all 9 districts, and the other, maintaining the current 9-member structure and adding 2 districts. Well, the voters chose, and they chose overwhelmingly and decisively. 2-1 supporting 2-1 supporting adding 2 districts. And I think it was, 30 something or 40% that chose the 9 districts. And so the voters made it clear. So there was no confusion and no, in my opinion, no need for a charter amendment. What I think the reform needs to actually be is the threshold for charter amendments to get onto the ballot to begin with. And this is a Maryland state constitutional issue. Dating back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when the power in Maryland was largely in the hands of Baltimore City, the population was far different. And in order to control that power, they had added to the Maryland Constitution that charter amendments could be added with either the signatures of 20% of the voting age public, 20% of the voting age public, or 10,000 signatures, whichever is lower. And so now 10,000 signatures is lower. And in a population of 1.1 million people, 10,000 signatures is infinitesimally small.
1%.
1% of our overall population. 1%. In my opinion, that is not how democracy works. And from the dais, because again, this is all on YouTube, I said, let's look at California, land of the ballot initiatives. In order for anything to get in the ballot in California, there are various thresholds. For a piece of legislation, I think it's 5 or 6%. For a constitutional amendment, I think it's 7 or 8%, somewhere around there. But you understand the point I'm making. And so I have made direct appeals to our state lawmakers. I have spoken directly with the Maryland Senate President, Bill Ferguson. and said, this needs to change statewide. I'll use the word unfortunately, this is a problem unique to Montgomery County. Not many other jurisdictions have this issue where voters will mobilize and get something on the ballot with a mere 10,000 signature requirement. And I hope you all understand, I'm not talking about any one proposal in particular. And nothing I'm talking about today is about one person or one proposal. It's about good government. And so I have argued that we need to increase that threshold, but that would require this General Assembly to make that change, to support it overwhelmingly, to put it on the ballot, and then to have it go to all the voters of Maryland. I'll end on this because it is outside your scope of purview, but one of the ways, instead of having a constitutional amendment that raises that threshold, it has been proposed previously, years ago in Annapolis, that a constitutional amendment be proposed that would let each county come up with its own threshold, which might then come back to the Charter Review Commission or a future Charter Review Commission. But instead of, back to the question, instead of the charter, our charter, trying to dictate the balls and strikes here, I think it requires a state level change to help mitigate this.
You started off by saying we should keep the conversation going. So this was really helpful in terms of putting some issues on the table that might be, fruitful. So how do we keep the conversation going?
So I'm here. Know that you can always reach out to me, call me or email me. I'm happy to engage. Clearly, I appreciate this commission very much so. My background, for those of you who don't know, I studied journalism and political science at American University and then went on to work at CNN for 12 years. And I covered Congress and presidential politics. And while some of that is the day-to-day stuff, I'll minimize it that way, that you see on TV, I thoroughly enjoyed the committees and thoroughly enjoyed government. And I was there during the great debates of the federal marriage amendment. As a gay man covering Congress, walking around the halls, hearing people debate about my future. Part of it was political, but it would be something enshrined in the Constitution. I share that just as perspective because the work that you're doing is really important. And it is as much about governing today as much as it is governing in the future. And so I'm here today. I know that next month, I think Vice President Friedson will be coming. I'm not sure when the county executive will be coming. And then you all have your own networks, whether they are political clubs of every stripe or civic organizations or any other type of affiliation. You all are here for a reason and you all have your own networks. And so as you read the paper, as you see what's happening, let me know, bring those conversations here. Kondakile will share with us, the minutes and report out. And it's something that I look at, and I know that Dale, on behalf of the county executive, looks at as well. But it's all about having those conversations so that I don't necessarily think any of us should be leading you, but we should make sure that you don't go so far astray that your work is not adopted.
So would it be
That's a fair balance.
would it be fair to say that, to summarize that when you get the minutes, if you see something that looks like we're going astray, there would be some feedback?
Not necessarily. I'm not sure I would necessarily, so I know some of you. For those of you who don't know me, I'd encourage you, maybe if something piqued your interest, reach out to me, reach out to the county executive. Recognizing that with the county executive and 11 members of the council, 11 different people, 12 different people, you might have 12 different opinions, you might have 24 different opinions, right? It all depends on what that issue is. And so I don't expect you to get consensus, but there should be some tacit agreement or approval of saying, that's worth considering, right? And keep having your conversations. Because again, last thing any of us want is for you to hone in on an issue, propose a charter amendment, come before the council with that charter amendment and have us say, thanks, but no thanks. And that might happen. It might happen on a 6-5 vote. It might happen on a 7-4 vote, but I don't want it to be a unanimous. We don't support that.
A quick question, when you mentioned political, just how would you define a dividing line between political versus, you know, in terms of what I brought up before, how would you look at what you would view as being more of a political question versus a charter question? In terms of guiding discussion.
Yeah, so I would argue, anything that's in the budget is policy and political, because that goes through the political process. It goes through the engagement and lobbying process. I mean, every penny in the budget is lobbied for by somebody, every penny. And so to take something out from there and to mandate it in some way in the charter, I you know, kind of going back to the People's Council.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah, or anything else. I would argue that's policy or political. You know, and with regard to MCPS, which is mandated, that's state. And so there's nothing I believe that can be done in the charter to manage that. I will say as an aside, if there's anything that we can do to improve relationships between the county executive, the council, and MCPS, I welcome that. It is much needed, but I think that is way beyond the scope of the charter.
Is that the only independent body that you think?
Say that again?
Is that the only independent body that's?
Yeah, because MCPS, as allowed by state law, once the executive writes the budget and the council amends it, we amended it, right? We added to it this year. Or took away from it, however you want to think about it. Once we basically write that check to MCPS, there really is no further checks and balances. And that's based on state law. And that's outside the scope here. Everything else has a check, whether it's, you know, the county executive function, our oversight function, but the MCPS does not report to us.
Then there's some bi-county commissions. Again, how do those fit into this?
Yeah, so we have Maryland National Park and Planning Commission and also WSSC, which we were just talking about at the beginning. Those, I'm not sure if there are any others. I think those are the big ones, right? Those are required by state law. And so while we can control the budget and for Maryland National Park and Planning Commission, which is the planning department and the parks department, and we can control the budget and rate increases for WSSC, the functions therein are governed by state law. And so that would require folks in the General Assembly to fix that.
But you do set taxation rates for property taxes in some way that affects the school's budget, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And we have the right to do that. This year, you know, there was a proposal to increase property taxes by 10% by the county executive. The council ultimately landed at raising property taxes by 4.7%. There are conversations in Annapolis about changing the rates that are allowed, changing the buildings that fall under those rates, but all of that would be state law. So I hope I got your juices flowing for the next many months and 3 years. Don't be overwhelmed, don't be disheartened by some of the realities I'm sharing with you. I share it with, you know, open eyes, not as a way to discourage, but as a way to maybe hone in on where you are. I would encourage you to look at the council's rules. Again, I would not necessarily advocate changing or mandating those changes. They seem to have worked pretty well. But, you know, I look forward to future conversations, particularly as you speak with council members, speak with the county executive, and speak with, you know, go back to some of your groups and neighbors and just kind of see what they're thinking.
What made you switch from being a reporter to becoming becoming a politician? Well,
Becoming a politician, yeah. That's a good question. So, and I'll end on this note. So, I was at CNN for 12 years and I absolutely loved it. Traveled the country, had a front row seat to history, and worked with the best journalists in the country. And I had moved to Montgomery County right after graduation. I moved to Bethesda and then ended up moving to downtown Silver Spring in the early 2000s as Discovery Channel had just opened up its building and downtown Silver Spring was growing. And I was part of a bunch of new residents who were moving into what's now called South Silver Spring, down by where Denizens Brewing is, right, East-West Highway by Georgia and Colesville. And as I was moving down there, living down there, I'm walking to the metro to take the red line to Union Station where CNN is still located. And the sidewalks were crumbling and there was no safe way to cross East-West Highway to get to the metro. And I thought to myself, I know how Congress works, I know how the federal government works, but who do I talk to about fixing sidewalks? And so 15 years later, I'm an at-large member. I'm chair of the Transportation Committee. I just passed the Safe Streets Act. Yesterday, we just approved the pedestrian master plan.
My sidewalks.
And so literally it was sidewalks. And I fixed sidewalks in my neighborhood. My neighbors said we need to do more things. And during the day, I was on Capitol Hill. And at night, I'd rush home to go to meetings with Dale before he is where he is. And so many other people. And it kind of filled me because during the day I didn't have opinions. And at night I was able to make things happen. And the reasons my colleagues at CNN were allowed me to do this is because while sidewalks might be controversial, they're not political. There's not a Republican or Democratic view. There's a neighbor by neighbor view. And so over the course of my, just kind of political engagement, people asked if I was interested in running for a state delegate or going to Annapolis. And I said I was not at the time because everything I was doing was less political, Democrat, Republican, which is what Annapolis mostly is, and it was more civic. Not to say that this is a less political place, but the issues, as you all know, cut across. There is no Democratic view on any particular issue here, which is why with a Democratic county executive and an 11-member all Democratic council, we have quite disagreements because they cut a lot of different ways. But
Democratic council?
all Democratic council. Right. Some people might not think that by looking at the way we vote, but it is an all Democratic council. But ultimately, I find it far more rewarding helping make change happen than to be an objective observer. And I appreciate all of your willingness to help make change happen. And let's just continue talking. Okay. David, do you have last comment?
Yeah, well, just one last question. I noticed in the composition of the commission that the county executive appointed a Republican and some Democrats and independents. The council only appointed independents and Democrats. Why did the council appoint a Republican?
So there is a mix that's required. That you can't have any more than, what is it, 6, more than 6 of one political party. And so I can't speak as to why every individual was appointed. I certainly can't speak for why the county executive appointed who he appointed. But given the mix and given the applicants, I think it's fair to say we all thought you were the best.
Thank you.
Is that a fair political statement? There you go. I'll end on that note. Thank you. Let's keep talking, okay? Thank you. Have a good morning. You too.
All right. I have 30 seconds of housekeeping to do. We need approval for our agenda. It was circulated. Does anyone have proposed changes to this agenda?
Sorry, we don't have it up on the screen because of the Zoom, but if anyone needs a paper copy of the agenda, we have some.
Approval. Is there anyone opposed?
No, second.
If I don't hear any oppositions, we will let the record reflect that it was adopted by unanimous consent. Do I hear an objection? Oh, thank you. Next, approval of the minutes of our September 13th meeting. Same situation. It was circulated. Does anybody have any proposed changes to the amendments?
A clarification on 3A, where it says Montgomery County provides its powers to the state of Maryland legislature.
Drives.
Yeah, that's actually the word that I was thinking it should be.
I'd be okay with that. Is anybody opposed to substituting derives from or abides? Let that be the case. Any other suggested changes? I hear a motion to adopt the agenda as amended with that one word change. Seconds. I don't hear any opposition. I hear any opposition? Not, we will deem it to be adopted by unanimous consent. Let us move into the issues for consideration. We have a little less time than we thought, but I think our task this morning is relatively easy, which is listing topics, not debating or discussing topics, but listing them so that we can begin to compile our list of things for discussion at our next meeting. I am going to start by putting one item on the list that I'm interested in, and then we will go around the table and see how many other topics. I think, and I would like, personally think, the best thing for us to do would be to focus on those topics that we think are most in need of attention in our first report in April. And particularly keeping in mind that that report will be the one that's used to decide whether something goes on the ballot in 2024 that might affect the 2026 election. Once we get past this year, it will go in our 2026 report, obviously, and would have to wait until a 2028 election. So I would think we would want to prioritize those issues that have more immediacy for our first report in April. Not that we can't list topics, but in terms of prioritizing what things we can get to first, second, and third. The issue I would like to put on the table is the one I raised, Council President Glass, which is the direct election by voters of council president and whether that has efficacy. And there are many permutations of that I think that we could explore. But that concept, I think, is one that I would like to put on the table. It would amend section 108 of our charter. That's the first topic. We can go in any order. I'm going to go to my right and start with.
Do you want a motion? Or is
No, this is not up or down. We're just compiling a list. Between now and our next meeting, our staff will give us some assistance in telling us which things on this list have been studied before, direct us to whether or not they're in a prior report.
Okay, so we're just making a list.
Just making a list right now, and so anybody's welcome to throw things on the list. We have enough time. If at the end of our going around and putting things on the list, we have extra time, we can decide how to use that and whether or not some of this warrants further discussion, but I'm not sure we're gonna have that time. Do you have anything for the list? No. Okay. Marvin.
Just maybe some clarification on compensation of council members. I probably can find that pretty clearly, but it says the council shall prescribe by law the compensation for its members, and whether that process undertakes some review, research by another body or whatever. I'm not sure.
I believe it's in the county code, and I believe I've seen it, and it's in the neighborhood of, I think, high 140s or low 150s, but.
The budgetary provision, section 302, section 303, 4 and 5, are very confusing. From a timing standpoint, and a definitional standpoint, there's multiple definitions of program and budget. And the approval levels, personally, I think need to be looked at. Some changes could be made with, for an example, 6 members, some with 7, some with others. So I would like to just put on the list to look at potential changes to the budgetary sections of the chart. I have some ideas, but I just put that on the table.
And well, you can certainly use some time between now and then. You can refine it, and even if you want to break that down to subparts, that'd be great.
So something that could be a chart, an amendment.
David.
I was curious, we received a list of the issues, because considered by the commissions over the last 20 years or so. A lot of the repetition there of issues, sometimes changing the wording a bit, but the issues remained. And I'm wondering how many of those actually got a final decision, or just were dropped because nobody could ever make their mind up about them. And whether some of those still should be revived. I would like to look at that list again, just to see if there's anything that piques my interest. But at the present time, I don't have anything.
And like I said, is we sort of, because we've got 2 semesters, we'll have plenty of time to go into the next semester too. Marcella.
I don't really have anything per se. I need to do more research, but I would be interested in touching the subject that he mentioned of taxation. I know that council member, I think his name is Joando, last time, well, he just said, I didn't know this, but the executive had proposed a 10% taxation to properties. And I didn't know that. I only knew the part that Councilman Joando ended up to be 4%, and he proposed that. But I feel I'm interested in talking about that more and how I just feel like well, he mentioned that it was a priority of his when he came. And to me, as a taxpayer, it seems to me there's a lot of waste. And I'd like to know more and talk more about how they focus so much on taxation as opposed to maybe use the money that's already out there to send the money to all these other projects that are going on in the government. So I need to refine that more, obviously, but since he mentioned that as well, that's one of his interests.
I threw my one topic out on the table and was told it was too political. I'm not entirely sure that saying anything that has a budget item can't be talked about, because everything is budget, as he says, every penny is budgeted for. I took a quick look at the rest of them. I need to go back. I've got a major conference I'm running at the end of the month, and after that, my life will be a lot better. But I do want to look at the previous list again as well and see what went up and why it hasn't gone up and so forth. I don't have a whole lot on my new things to think about list.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, right?
Right. And after November 1, I will be in a much better position to put on my running shoes.
Point of clarification, since we're keeping track of the list, so is the People's Council, have you, based on the conversation with the CP, is that off, or you still want that?
I'd still like to look at it a little bit. And just sort of see where it's been at and what's happened with it over the years and so forth. At least when I look at it a little bit.
And if you'll go back and look at our report, the commission's prior report, you'll see that even topics that were decided not to be acted on are just, in other words, if we consider a topic and we decide not to go forward on it, so some of the past reports have in fact said the commission spent this amount of time on it. We considered it, we rejected it for the following reasons, and we moved on. So it's legitimate to have the discussion, sir.
On the issue of taxation, again, the issue of setting rates is one thing. I don't know whether it's said at state law or at the county level that we have things like homestead exceptions that are ways for people's property taxes to be reduced despite whatever the rate increase is, because somehow some part of it is written off. You know, where does the authority lie for creating those exemptions that limit how much a person has to pay in property tax? Where are the criteria in place for deciding whether, you know, that sounds like a political decision, but how much of it relates to the charter?
I think that would be a good topic for us to get some advice from our staff. Is we put this on the list and you can come back and tell us where it is and whether it's on the table or hard for is something we're not allowed to deal with. Jeffrey, I don't know if you can see us in the room here, but you're next.
I see you, I hear you. So I had two, other than the direct election of the council president, I have section 310, which is related to the surplus. I'm used to running city governments where you needed a certain number of months of reserves to make sure that if in an emergency you had coverage. I'm not sure whether 5% is gonna do that, especially given climate change and all the other things that go on these days. So I'd like to take a look at section 310 and see how that applies to that.
Sounds interesting.
And I think the issues presented so far are interesting, and I'm pleased to run those.
I don't know, I don't think I missed anybody unless we have somebody on the Zoom that I'm not seeing on the screen. No, we're good?
Just me.
All right, thank you. We did this and pretty much, we're right on schedule, so that's great. All right, with that, I think we had some requests after the last meeting, to have staff go over a few things that might have not, they did not get to discuss last time. I'm going to turn it back to Brenda Keeley and send you, who's got some items on staff notes.
Sure, so I brought the forms that were circulated before, and I had, didn't get into too much detail with them last time, so if there's specific questions, I'm happy to address them, but just by way of reminder, there were 3 forms, in addition to all the training requirements, which it sounded like that's clear. There is a reimbursement form. A reimbursement form for members of the boards, committees, and commissions. And just keep in mind, this is county-wide, so this is not specific to this particular commission. But just for your purposes, if you need to seek reimbursement for your transportation, as an administrative convenience, rather than tracking your mileage and your receipts and stuff, if you were in person at a meeting, then it's a $10 per meeting reimbursement is what this is. And so just make sure you fill it out, turn it over to me. And
How often do you want it? Yeah. Once a quarter?
we should, so payments actually need to be processed quarterly. And so, yes, I would say, try and get them to me quarterly. We started meeting in September, so just make sure I get these by December.
Are receipts required or just filling out the form?
No, so the reimbursement form does not, of course, one has to have been here in person. So for instance, if you're on Zoom, then there's no parking reimbursement, I'm stating the obvious, but other than the fact that you were present, there is no receipt required.
So the maximum that you can be reimbursed is $10, because last time I got an Uber, my car was in the shop and it was $23. So I would just get $10.
It's a flat fee. So the parking reimbursement is a flat fee, and then we don't bother track whether you took the metro, took the Uber, or drove.
Well, I only spent $9. I still get 10. Okay.
So that's on the reimbursement. There were 2 other volunteer forms. One, yes.
Since I look at that budget from the executive side, you don't have to submit if you don't want. Just put that out there.
When I get to $9 extra,
There's a general volunteer registration form. That one, everybody should fill that out. Just it has you on record as being a volunteer for the county. The last one is the driver volunteer registration form, and as staff, I have to say, I don't know a whole lot about the detail on this one, except, what the bottom line on this one is, if, knocking on wood, we hope no one had an accident, but if you did, your vehicle insurance, because the county is self-insured, so your vehicle, the limits on your vehicle insurance would kick in first, I believe, that's how I understand it. But you ought to have you want to have a vehicle registration as a volunteer if you're going to be covered by the county's insurance program.
And people going, how is this ever going to happen? I'm going, remember, we are hoping at some point to have some meetings with our regional advisory boards. So you may be traveling out to one of our meetings, and you may have somebody from our commission in your car with you carpooling, so it could actually happen.
Yes. There is a phone number at the bottom of that form that's the number for our risk management division. As you fill that out, if you have questions, I think they would be more helpful to you than I could be.
These things that are filled out.
These have to be
Pen and-
signed by
pen and ink.
supervisor. Who is that?
Just turn them over to me and I'll have someone on the council. For purposes of these forms, the department is the council. Just, if you're required to fill out the department, it's a council.
Can you email the forms to us and or give us a link to where we can get them?
I attach them to, we make a note to resend.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
send them all.
Okay.
They were part of the first email
Oh, they're-
chain that went out, but I'll
Okay.
not a problem to resend it.
As a chair.
I'm gonna send a follow-up.
Chair Michaels, there's a question.
If I may, and relating to the emergency, we attend meetings here, but if we, as mentioned, go to a meeting with an advisory board or a listening session, are those also meetings that are eligible for reimbursement?
They are.
Okay.
So are these electronic forms or are these pen and ink forms?
They can be filled out electronically and emailed in, but you can sign it digitally or, but you could email it to us. They should have the function to be filled out. If not, email me, I'll make it.
Okay.
In addition to the parking, there is a pendant form. If you have to make arrangements in order to have someone look at a dependent, either a child or an adult, that also is available for reimbursement if that was necessary for you to be able to attend this meeting or one of the, the external meetings.
Childcare, we're talking about.
Childcare or adult, adult care, either one of those, if you had to make that arrangement to be able to participate.
You have other items?
I have nothing to add. Thank you very much. I think we've been receiving the certificates for your training, so I appreciate that. And I think the chair had a question about whether I conferred with OCA, and it turns out if you've done it once, it's enough. So the parliamentary, if you were on another board and had done the parliamentary training, that counts. So the fact that you provided the certificate is sufficient.
Right, thank you. Our first meeting was in the last quarter, so this reimbursement should be turned in for one meeting. Unless you want us to save it for the end of the next quarter.
You can turn them in as frequently as you like. I can even take them at every meeting, but then just don't go more than 3 months before you turn them in.
Okay. Right.
One I can take.
I think I have to sign it.
Can I? Since Evan raised it, I'm gonna ask, where would we find a copy of the council's rules? Are they online? Are they not online?
They are an appendix to the code. We certainly can send you a link to them.
Okay.
But yes, they are.
I haven't noted to send in a follow-up.
I wouldn't assume, every time I go online, I'm like, is this up to date? Because I don't know how often the online stuff is up to date.
They were last updated in the online version should be up to date, I believe
Yeah,
now.
the new rules are up.
The new rules are up because they were updated in January.
The link would be great.
Sure.
Okay, we have enough time to go around and say, does anybody have anything for this meeting they would like to bring up or discuss before we adjourn?
Yeah. So I was just gonna throw out an offer. It never hurts to do something a bit social to get to know each other. So I was gonna throw out an offer. If people are interested in a private tour of the West Wing, I'd be happy to take people around the West Wing. That would be a nice opportunity for people to talk and walk and get to know each other. I can take up to 6 people at the same time. I'll send Jim a date, if you would mind sending it out, for 6 people who.
You said West Wing what?
White House.
Oh, okay.
Really?
Casablanca.
Sorry, that's where I work. I work in the White House, and so I have the ability to take people on private tours. Limited ability. I take up to 6 people at a time.
Do you need a background? Do we need a background check?
It will be part of the registration.
Are you worried about that?
What happens is I'll send a date to Jim. Jim will send it around. If people then respond to me, I'll send them a link. and they'll put their details in. Be really careful when putting your details in because the Secret Service mean business.
Very generous of you to do that, really.
It's pretty fun. It's a pretty interesting place to look around. So
Thank
I
you.
put that on the table as an offer.
We gonna see any famous actors wandering around or?
Say that again.
Are we gonna see any famous actors wandering around or are they all along somewhere?
Actors not so many, but you might see the president. He's fairly famous
Okay,
too.
one question about intercommission communications. The list of these issues is going to be circulated to us. How do we respond to?
At our next meeting.
All?
So the cautionary advice we've given in the past is if you have responses, send them directly to the chair and not reply all. And then those will be collected and shared in the open meeting.
And I believe our next meeting, that we'll start off with agenda with the intent to start discussing them and figuring out, what our next steps are in terms of who wants to study them, research them, who's going to volunteer to do what, which topics, and we'll move from there.
Should we, if we do get more diligent and look back at the issues and come up with some more before the next meeting, should we send those to you and?
Yes, and I would encourage folks, for those of you who put a topic on the table, to do whatever background work you think you make sense that you're capable of doing between now and November. So that perhaps it will be able to inform us as we discuss it, because we do have to sort of decide relatively soon which ones we want to take up and start studying in earnest, so that by January, February, we're prepared to have recommendations. So since the work needs to begin, we're going to have to get serious about picking the topics we are going to go forward on. So the more information we know in November, I think the easier that'll be.
And since you meet once a month, if it would help with the efficiency of running things, you could always set up committees.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is, if we have topics on the table in November, then we'll know, what committees, what people are willing to commit to in terms of forming a committee and being on the committee.
One more comment on that. For example, the budgetary section, being an accountant, a retired accountant, I'm kind of naturally gravitating to that. But that seems to be, it's kind of a complicated issue. Some people might be more acclimated to, or interested in pursuing that and drilling down on those particular sections. That seems to me to be a natural subcommittee, a vision where we can find ourselves.
And you might think of it as a work plan, which is, since you have the most interest in the topic and you seem to have some background, you might kind of look at it and say, well, the work plan would be, let's focus on this aspect of it first, this aspect of it second. These are the, particular parts of it I want to focus on, and this is the order. And it may be you figure out that, not all of it can be addressed in between now and April, or maybe none of it can be addressed between now and April. But like I said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we have 3 years plus.
So the question is, how do we set up the subcommittee?
Well, we can do that here. Some organizations, it's the discretion of the chair to form subcommittees, but you might be able to be more collegial than that.
We can bring you more information at the next meeting about the formation of committees, unless you wanted, was that something you were looking to do now?
I don't think we can do it now. I think
We'll bring more information to the next meeting.
anything else before we adjourn?
Well, there's nothing to prevent us privately from communicating with another commission member.
Absolutely. As long as you don't raise a quorum issue and get 6 people having a offline meeting or online meeting, you're fine. Okay, thank you very much, folks. Oops, Marcel.
All right, I'll be interested in hearing from you. How do you feel about the presentation of President Glass? And how
You're welcome to call me. I'm not touching that at the public. Football, I'm sorry. You're
how
welcome.
did you understand his message was for us, his minorities, etc.? I don't know if
I'm not gonna paraphrase or put words in his mouth. But he's quite eloquent, and I think he did a really nice job of presenting his views. But like I said, give me a
he
call.
covered a lot and he went through different topics. And what I got was he wanted us to focus on taxation and terms, right? And the election of the council president, yes?
Yes, and we're gonna hear from the vice president soon, probably soon to be president, Andrew Friedson, next month. And then we're gonna hear from our county executive in December. So we're gonna have potentially 3 different viewpoints. And I think because that will take us for the whole year, and we do have to get moving by, make some decisions in January and February. It may be that, like I said, what we hear from them is something for us to, incorporate and consider over the long run, not the short run. I think we're gonna have to kind of take both views and then start moving on the short run while we hear from them on what might be for the long run.
I was surprised that he said that he wasn't expecting, and even that he didn't want to be reelected at the end of the year, and that the vice president was going to, and it's hard to comprehend for me that I belong to, a board in my condominium, that as the president, you don't want to continue being the president because there are so many things that you want to do, and a year is just not enough. And sometimes the next person that comes along doesn't necessarily have the same vision or the same goals. And I don't know how they can get anything done in 1 year, really.
I think he specifically said he did want to be president for longer.
I thought that he said no, he wasn't
And
expecting.
he specifically said that he wanted it to be a longer term, but it wasn't.
Right.
And he didn't expect it to be a longer term.
Didn't expect it, right.
He said he wanted, he very clearly said he thought there should be longer terms.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, how can they get anything done in 1 year? It's just not enough time.
I think that was his point.
All right, thank you. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second,
Second.
if there's no objection, it will be unanimous consent to adjourn.
See you next month, everyone.
Thank you.
I'm
Yeah, we'll select. People to bring up.
Simon David there.
Yes, I will send you specific dates that we